I never thought I could be more surprised, but I guess the Trump administration continues its path. This is deeply disturbing. Who gave the orders to do this, to surveil a United States ambassador? And did it lead to the warning that she needs to move back, that they feared for her safety operating in Ukraine? Safety from whom? Who was making these threats? Obviously, this requires another full investigation to make sure this sort of thing never happens again, and those responsible are held accountable.
I want to read to you what the chairs of the committees investigating the investigation into the impeachment wrote. Chairs Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, Carolyn Maloney, and Elliot Engel wrote these documents, and those recently released pursuant to Freedom of Information Act demonstrate that there's more evidence relevant to the president's scheme, but they have been concealed by the president himself. All of this new evidence confirms what we already know. The president and his associates pursued Ukrainian officials to announce investigations that would benefit the president politically. There cannot be a full and fair trial in the Senate without the documents that President Trump is refusing to provide to Congress. Now, that's a letter. What do you do about this? What do you do about the fact that there is new evidence that ultimately may influence how a vote goes in the Senate?
Well, look, we need four Republican senators to develop a backbone to do the right thing that 72% of the American people want. They want those documents. They want those witnesses to come forth and tell us what we need to know, what the president is hiding. The fact of the matter is this is only one subpoena. There's 5 major subpoenas of documents they have blocked, 9 major witnesses that we have subpoenaed who refuse to testify.
Jill, let me ask you about this. Marie Yovanovitch's lawyer has put out a response to the idea that she was being tracked. Her physical movements were being tracked with her phone, and her computer use were being tracked. The lawyer, Lawrence Robbins, says, needless to say, the notion that American citizens and others were monitoring Ambassador Yovanovitch's movements for unknown purposes is disturbing. We trust that the appropriate authorities will conduct an investigation to determine what happened. Except it seems like whoever was involved in this was involved in whatever it is that the drug deal that John Bolton said that Giuliani and Trump were involved in. So I don't know who's going to investigate, but this does seem to be a serious matter.
It's particularly alarming, and you are exactly correct, because William Barr, who should be doing this, is looking exactly the other way and doing everything he can to defend the president and not to find the truth and the facts. These are things that should not be going on against any American citizen, overseas or at home. And yet it was happening, and the evidence seems to be growing dramatically. And I want to point out that it is not unusual for evidence to come out after an indictment, which the impeachment is. And during Watergate, the smoking gun tape was gotten through a trial subpoena. We had already returned indictments and had all of the evidence that was for pretrial. But once we indicted, we issued another subpoena to get more evidence for the trial. The standard of proof at a trial is beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard of proof to indict is just that there's probable cause to bring someone to trial. And so it makes a lot of sense that there be a full and fair hearing, that there be witnesses, that all of these people whose documents we're now seeing should be testifying, along with Bolton and Giuliani and Parnas and Duffy and maybe Pompeo and many others who should be before the Senate. You cannot have exoneration after a trial unless you actually have a trial, and that requires these documents and that the witnesses come forward.
Well, except, Mieke, the president will say that he's exonerated if he doesn't get convicted by the Senate. But they're interesting matters, because there are a lot of senators talking about the fact that whatever you think about the president, this isn't illegal. These aren't even crimes, let alone high crimes, except we're hearing these things from Lev Parnas that sound very much like crimes. We're hearing about the withholding of congressionally approved military assistance to Ukraine, that it's not legal for that. It's very specifically not legal for the president to hold that kind of money back or to redirect that kind of money. So at some point, the argument starts to ring hollow that no laws have been broken in the midst of whatever it was that started in May and ended in September between the president of the United States and the president of Ukraine.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, Lev Parnas was indicted on a criminal matter for his involvement in this scheme in which the president was an actual actor. These text messages show that part of what Lev Parnas was indicted for was trying to get Yovanovitch fired, and that he and Rudy Giuliani were involved in this up to their necks, that Giuliani was in communication with the White House about this, and that the president actually fired Yovanovitch. Now, I think there's some real questions here about what the president knew, when did he knew it, and how all these things transferred. But the president in these documents says that his own personal lawyer can go represent Lev Parnas. So he has a very tight relationship here. We need to know more about it, which is why they need to call the witnesses.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.